so we're here to talk about the Linaro Android Toolchain distribution. A few topics in mind here. Now this is something I am personally less comfortable and familiar with, so I'm going to be really relying on anyone who has more experience with this than I do. Mainly in the toolchain, compiler changes and things like that, how that all gets distributed. I can certainly talk about the Android NDK components, but the toolchain stuff, that's kind of interesting. So, NDK and platform distribution. So, Android is composed of three different parts, roughly. There's the kernel, there's the NDK, and there's the SDK. The SDK is what all the Windows Eclipse programmers use. The NDK is pretty much your C code, libraries, and of course the kernel is the kernel. Together, everything is the platform, but since the NDK contains the toolchain, as does the SDK, if we're going to make toolchain improvements, we have to distribute it or do something about that. So does anybody have any thoughts about distribution of this component?
Well, to start with, we for sure want to build it in Android tool service. That's a task, and there is, it's not yet done, but there is good movement into that direction.
Okay.
So it will be, as a toolchain itself, will be built there. The question would be, what else needs to be added to make it NDK? So what was the missing part for NDK?
Okay, so then I remember some talk about making sure that we build the NDK in the way that Google builds the NDK. I believe, is Jim here? Hey, your NDK work. Did you have any?
Oh, yeah. So I think the major problem is not packaging, but the major problem should be how can we utilize the latest toolchain, including the right C flags and the right configuration for target other than the default configuration. Let's say MV5 and MV7 plus Neon. Because you have to consider the case, so like on Cortex A9. There is no exact or corresponding configuration for Cortex A9 in Android NDK or in Android build system. It's still very roughly MV7 and MV7 plus Neon. Yeah. So I think the problem is once we pack NDK, we have to adjust the configuration and adjust the default flag. Because Google engineer already make NDK as simple as possible, so you don't have to assign the build time parameter when you build native activity on GNI allocation with GNI. So we have to prepare such thing.
So it sounds like our work here is probably one of the most important things we're going to do, and probably also one of the hardest, because of the nature of work. That if we're going to expand to other, I don't want to say ARM cores. I was told not to use the term architecture, but what's the
It's probably cores or micro architectures. It's,
micro architectures? That's a better word.
that's a better word
Okay.
than an architecture, because the A9 implements the V7A architecture.
Right.
And so does the A8 and so does
Right.
A5.
Right. That's fair. That's fair. You get used to using loose terms when you're.
Sorry, I'm a compiler engineer and I'm just too.
No, I absolutely appreciate the correction. It is very important, especially in this topic. No, I remember when I first started working with ARM and I had to go on the ARM website, which is getting better actually. And you go through it. Well, it's even worse because with the SOCs, all the documentation is everywhere, right? Because you have this core and this core, and you have that. Anyway.
So, when, just maybe it's a fundamental question, but just for my understanding, when you talk about Linaro Android Toolchain, I'm assuming that the Android Toolchain today that's in part of the NDK has whatever patches Android puts on it.
Yep.
And of course, with the Linaro Toolchain, we provide our own toolchain,
Right.
with our own patches. So, are you planning on sort of creating a merged thing which has the Linaro patches and the Android patches, or what is the toolchain you're going to trying to build?
Yes.
Yes.
The idea of all of the Linaro actually, and the whole point of this whole game is you have Google's toolchain, you have Linaro's toolchain. We're going to push patches into their system, and those patches will hopefully go upstream into Google's toolchain, and there will not be a delta.
Oh, okay.
So that's the whole goal, right? Is to make
Okay.
to be a value add so that we can put the best, and Linaro of all organizations is in the best position to handle this.
So if we push our toolchain patches upstream and they become part of Google's NDK, why do we need to build another NDK ourselves?
Well, we need to build the NDK because there will always be a delta. So when you talk about, when I first started upstreaming, I always thought, oh, you push it upstream and it takes a week and da-da-da-da-da. But it turns out that there are patches that members might want to use that are not upstream. You have to host those somewhere. It's not enough to get an email together and say, just apply such and such. Members really want a fully baked, tested, all the patches integrated kind of thing. So that's where the Android platform team comes in to the picture. Our job is to actually integrate that and to make that as easy as possible.
Okay. So, but that means that you have to create a toolchain that has at least some patches that you do merge in on top of whatever is currently in Android.
Right.
So I guess then the question becomes, if you do that merge, who resolves conflicts and how do you test and validate to ensure that whatever you get out of that actually works as a toolchain correctly?
Yes, so because the Android platform team is small and we are integrators more than anything else, then the actual toolchain engineers will need to, you'll need to test what you're doing.
We test what we are doing, but you don't have Android patches in there, so.
Sure. And so we actually, that's something that we have to work out is and to explore.
Let me describe what we have now, what we use now. So, as far as I know, Google currently doesn't support building Android with GCC 4.5, and Linaro Toolchain is GCC 4.5. So we take toolchain source from toolchain working group, as far as I know, without any patches. We drop it into Google toolchain build system and just put there.
And
so
that builds Android?
as far as I know, yes, we currently don't apply any special Android patches. So Google has patches for GCC 4.4, for example. Supposedly they already upstream in GCC. So in .5 we already have some in Linaro Toolchain.
Oh, okay.
So this is how it is now. We don't know if it's perfect. So probably there would be more patches.
So that's interesting. I have never looked into the Android GCC. I did look into the Android GDB repository because there was some mail that somebody complained that it doesn't work. And the Android GDB Git repository definitely has patches that are not upstream, will never go upstream, just hex to workarounds and Android stuff. And without that, it will not work if they are needed. So
I guess yes, because GDB has to work across ADB transport and probably some special support. But main toolchain like GCC tools is probably can be pushed upstream.
well, that's of course ideal.
So yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. So everybody has the same problem. Nobody's special in this regard in terms of hacks that make Android work that are not appropriate for open source and upstream. So part of Linaro's job is actually to minimize those hacks, to clean things up, to make things, because there are a lot of fantastic ideas in the Android work, in the Google work. It's just that they're busy putting platforms out, and they've had so many problems with upstream that they've decided not to do it. So Linaro can come in, and we're not under the same pressures that they are. Actually, our pressures are get it upstream.
So I've just noticed in the GCC project recently, there have been a whole load of Google-specific branches that have been created. So how does that tie in with the work that we are doing? So is it that Google is going upstream now directly for Android toolchain patches?
Well, Google, of course, can do whatever they like, and I'm sure that there is still a mandate at Google probably to try to upstream as much as possible. So we're going to be going upstream, they're going to be going upstream. We're all trying to build Android in our toolchain. So it really just becomes, if you have a tree that has patches that haven't reached their final destination, we have to host that, track that, and provide that to our members in a tested build. But I imagine that hopefully the number of those trees will be small. Because we also have to do, we're also going to have all these different SOC vendors with every single different SOC in the Android environment to support all sorts of different microarchitectures and different vendor-specific extensions.
It's just that was a very important contribution because that's a very significant difference between saying we just use the Linaro GCC, which we know works because we tested it, and just use it to build Android, versus we have to create a new toolchain source which is emerged from Linaro patches and some Android patches. Who knows how they interact, which would be something that would basically require a full test cycle on somebody
Right.
really understands the toolchain to look into what's going on there.
Right.
So if that is not required, of course, it makes things a lot easier.
By all means, Android toolchain will be based on main Linaro toolchain. So there will be different configuration options, build options.
Okay.
But otherwise, maybe some patches, but it will be based on toolchain.
Okay.
So can the Linaro Android toolchain be redistributed by OEMs without issue?
Same issue we have. It's the same issue we have for everybody else. We have to sort that issue out. And I'll just take a note about it, which is licensing.
Well, if it's coming from the Linaro toolchain, why would the licensing be an issue?
We might not have a distribution allowance. We might just have.
OEM may need to
You
be
might want to check
redistributed.
about licensing with creating a new NDK and then distributing that.
Right.
That's probably going to be the bigger problem.
So problem is probably
Redistributing
just
just
not just.
I mean, if you are taking just the Linaro toolchain, I mean, there's no issues because we put that out under the FSF, under the GPL. But if there are NDK patches that go in, then
And we have the same issue with like hosting general Android builds anyway, right? We have all these huge binary blobs that support all the multimedia components.
Yeah.
And can you distribute those? Can you redistribute those? How are we going to handle that? So the platform team has a lot of work there anyway to make sure that, because you guys don't need to worry about that. You just need to worry about making the best possible toolchain in the universe. So, which is a much harder problem. Not being a kernel, I'm not being a compiler engineer.
Isn't GCC GPL? What's the license for GCC?
Oh, GPL.
GPL. So could there be any problems?
So the matter, we need to check licenses very carefully. Maybe for some patches, maybe for some parts of NDK. Because just toolchain shouldn't be a problem. But maybe if we put Android NDK, Google will come to us and say, hey guys, what are you doing? We do NDK for Android.
Because
Maybe.
like when Jim created the Android toolchain, he took Linaro toolchain and added the Android patches into tarball. You just have that like a pre-built toolchain. That shouldn't be any problems, I guess, if it's just GPL or
Are those Android patches GPL?
I guess they have to be if they're on EDC.
Yeah, I don't know. And also, does the toolchain have any optimization for the biopsy thing? Which I think is on the how much license, right?
Or Bionica is the license is BSD license.
Yeah, BSD is on the license, which you can be redistributed into any other license.
Yeah, so it's going to be very complicated, but well, maybe not complicated, but there's just going to be a lot of things a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross.
So you want to get some, you might want to also check what happens if you take the Android patches which are not upstream yet and merge them.
Yeah, yeah.
That's probably going to be the gray area. I'm not a lawyer.
Right.
And
I'm not a lawyer. You're not a lawyer. That's why I have this gigantic to-do.
Yeah.
Talk to the lawyers. Hang out with them.
But if they're practiced to something that is GPL, and they have delivered this, then the patches are also GPL.
The
That's
GPL
what-
only triggers on
that's
distribution, though.
Yeah, but since they have distributed, otherwise we couldn't.
that's
get
what
it.
it's supposed to be. But
Yeah.
So
We need to sort it out so that people don't. We need to have it, since we're all not lawyers. We need the lawyers to say this is the rules of engagement.
Yeah.
And
So
then
the action is to make sure that that's no license problem. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's move on. We can always come back. There's been a request. This is actually from Google for NDK support on Ubuntu, Fedora, and Mac. So I'm not entirely sure how we get here, who does this work. The Mac thing is the weird part, I think.
So maybe another stupid fundamental question, the NDK is a cross-build environment, right? So
Yes.
it's hosted, and we're talking about the host.
Right. So
Okay.
So the
What's the purpose of
deliverable,
this then?
what's that?
The purpose of NTK running on another Linux distribution so that it can run the native application?
So they can cross-build on Macs because everybody has a Mac at Google. They don't run Ubuntu. Actually, there's one of the two that are allowed. There's no Windows.
So the original NDK that you get from Google, where does that one?
Ubuntu.
On Ubuntu only.
Yes.
Okay.
It runs on Red Hat fairly easily. A few little issues, but so the question is, I guess the thing is who does the work?
Why do we care in supporting anything but Ubuntu as far as host?
Because we want to help the entire Android ecosystem, and we need to be, although as Linaro, we need to help the entire ARM ecosystem, and ARM is not just Ubuntu. People using ARM. So you can develop, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to develop ARM on Mac, for example. Develop for ARM on Macintosh. That should be allowed. You should support that. Ditto for, I think, ditto for that for Windows. It's just that the Windows thing is a much bigger deal. But, we should be inclusive and collaborate with people. Of course, we want them to run Ubuntu because but, we can't say, you have to use Ubuntu. We have to say, well, at least we're going to try for macOS.
So, but if you say that even Google's toolchain itself supports only Ubuntu, why should we sort of be the ones that increase this code base? If apparently that's enough for the Android ecosystem.
I think it should work for both. It says that it's tested
It's tested on Ubuntu, but it should work on Mac.
Yeah, so it's something like that.
It might just be a testing problem.
It depends on what the mode of distribution is. Are you packaging, what form are you packaging your NDK? I think the standard NDK comes out as a tar mode,
Yes.
in which case
Okay.
it should be all right to use it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
What would be the deliverable from Linaro? Would it be a, sudo apt-get ARM Linaro toolchain, or would it be, downloadable tarballs?
I think it should be sudo apt-get. How easy is that?
Ubuntu, so it'd be great.
Yep.
Yeah, that ties you to Ubuntu.
Well, it can
Yeah,
be-
unless
there can be
you have
multiple
apt-get
of them.
on Mac.
You don't have one of
No, that's true, that's true.
But the normal toolchain is in the Android gates, under pre-built.
It's pre-built.
So maybe we should put it there.
Just put it in the pre-built, yeah.
As a repo.
I think that's, although some people, I don't know, we can list it as a thing. What we actually end up doing is, it's a good idea.
So this is probably a stupid question. How compatible are builds from different toolchains? Someone's going to have their system that was first built with an Android Google toolchain, and then if we have our application, or someone has their application that they want to build, and they have to use something on our toolchain because it's convenient, will all hell break loose?
Well, so from a core ABI perspective, it doesn't break. That's just, if that does, that would be a very serious bug. But of course, there is more to compatibility than just the core ABI.
Yeah.
The problem, usually the problem comes down to versions of libraries that are being used. And that depends on a cross-compile environment. That's particularly interesting because in the cross-compile environment, you have libraries on your host. Usually you have a sysroot of some form or shape. And if what you have in the sysroot, if that doesn't match the system where you then deploy to, you can get mismatches.
Okay. So is there any ability to stay in sync with what Google's providing this as route? Because the Bionic's got to be the
So
same.
I don't know. That depends on what we're providing. Just because we provide a tool chain doesn't necessarily mean we need to provide a sysroot of our own. If there is a sysroot from Google, you should be able to just use that with our tool chain. But maybe we want to provide a new sysroot because the stuff in there should be built optimized or whatever. I don't know. But that's
It's a good question. I'll take it out.
Sysroot is important, even for building the toolchain itself. We need to define what source we should use. Does it use source Google upstream or our tree?
Also depends on what bugs have been fixed in the toolchain between the Google version and what we release. So,
The general idea maybe is that we should not use Google sysroot because we change things in our tree.
generally, if you cross-compile to a particular device, ideally your sysroot will always contain exactly what's on your device. So if we say we provide a new Android distribution that has all kinds of changed stuff in it, then all those changes should also be in our sysroot. But if we say we try to provide a new tool chain for stuff to run on a regular unchanged Android, then our sysroot should also be regular unchanged.
We change Android to yes.
So everything we change on the native Android should also be changed in the sysroot if it's a library.
One thing we are actually really gunning for is for Google to pick up our toolchain as the toolchain.
So much.
That would be that's the goal. So anything, and how we're going to do that is through various means, Mac OS support, benchmarking, politicking, you name it, right? But if that happens, that would be awesome.
So of course, if they are not even on 4.5 yet, usually in particular if there's lots of C++ code, if you go to a more recent GCC version, the compiler tends to be picky and pick up more errors in your actual errors in your source code, which previous compilers didn't notice, but current compiler will notice. That's why usually, talk to Matthias Klose when he updates to a new GCC release, he gets dozens or hundreds of package build failures.
Yeah.
And I would expect something similar to happen when building the Android.
Exactly, we already had it. So if
Oh,
we
you
built
had it,
with our toolchain, we had
Yeah.
like build failure.
Yes.
So, and we saw that it was fixed in Android Master,
Ah.
but not yet in the release,
Okay.
in the release that we use. So we had to cherry pick it into our build.
I mean, the other thing I'd like to stress too is I think that maybe even more than the kernel, I think that Linaro, because we have such a strong ARM backing, is in a unique position to really help Google and to collaborate with the Google toolchain engineers. More, because first off, the team is much smaller. And I think that that community is a lot tighter than the kernel community, and it's a lot easier to even get stuff done in that community and to actually collaborate. So even if they're just taking a lot of patches,
So do we know who the toolchain guys?
we can
are?
certainly figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah, syncing closely with Google seems like a great idea because, you know, from my perspective is as a user and you present me with different tool chains for building Android, I'm going to take the Google one because Google built the platform and set up this Git.
But we provided the mass platform.
Yeah.
So
So
you can see that
A
clear
real benefit?
benefit,
Yeah. Then sure, but
So-
otherwise, if it's giving me extra build errors, no thanks.
I mean, one thing that would be good, the nice thing about toolchain fixes, or it helps us in something we've been asked to do, which is identify those changes that have made a big impact on actual shipping devices. And toolchain changes are those changes. You know, they affect everyone. They have direct efficiency improvements, typically, or even just easier building, more correct builds, things like that. So those are the things we really want to be able to point out and say, look, you know, the Linaro toolchain is 10% better than the code source free toolchain, and so on and so forth.
But by the way, I just want to indicate one fact.
Maybe.
If you open the URL, it's a big that's a bug, and I just want to point out the fact that we should not only take care about toolchain, but also some helper utility like EF prelinker. Okay. So the bug is if we use the technical incorrect combination of utility and the GCC, and it will result in some empty symbol table, EF output with a simple EF table, which is fine, can be executed, but the prelinker, the Android prelinker is stupid, and they cannot recognize that.
Sure.
So our workaround is we just back to use older version of Ubuntu. Okay. So I think the problem should be exist for many cases. Maybe Google has improved version of EF prelinker in their internal tree.
Okay. So I guess that's a perfect bring up for what NDK components do we publish. These are things that we host because the changes aren't necessarily upstream. It sounds, GCC, GDB, bin utils, help, which go under helper. Anything else?
So, I mean, if we do publish a modified toolchain, I don't know if the indicator is just source or is it a full binary build of the whole stuff. Because if it's a whole binary build and we change the toolchain, do we want to rebuild everything with the new toolchain so that we actually see the effects of the toolchain? Or
I think so. Yeah.
do we want to publish the whole rebuild thing?
Uh-huh.
Well, then it's everything.
Yeah. That's okay. Say everything. Think big thoughts.
Also, there is no API components test case for NDK. So one potential risk is even we provide our own NDK, there is no insurance for compatibility. Because, I think Google engineer has no idea for the same case. Because there is only one maintainer for NDK inside Google.
So we've got compatibility tests, benchmark tests.
So what compatibility are you concerned about?
As far as I know, has API conformance test cases for AAPCS and so on, API. And the port is LSD, right? And like, something like that is a binary-based library conformance test.
So there are tests in the GCC test suite for the AAPCS,
Yeah.
the soft load calling convention, the base calling convention,
Yeah.
and the VFP calling convention.
Yeah.
And these are in there. So if you are running the GCC test suites, that should give you those results.
Okay.
Now, I understood that the Android ABI was essentially following the bare metal ABI rather than the Linux ABI. Correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't followed the developments very closely. But my understanding was that the Android ABI was essentially just following the bare metal
Okay.
ABI.
But there is no official document about that. I think that I have no idea about further development.
There is no code in the ARM backend which is special to Android that I know. The only thing I thought they had done was to rewire stuff so that it was using the base API. And I'll have to go back and look at the patches, but that's my understanding of it.
Okay.
Getting an official confirmation from Google would be useful.
So when you say rewire, are you talking about just config
Just
options?
config options, essentially just a new set of new triplet, which is
Okay.
ARM, Android,
Okay.
whatever. And then if I remember this right, it was following the bare metal configurations. So the difference between, two of the major differences between the bare metal configuration, the bare metal ABI and the Linux ABI is that you've got short enums on by default in the bare metal API, but not in the Linux API because of shared libraries. So I don't know what Google have done with respect to that. And the other one is the size of WHRT. Those are the two, usually the two critical questions, but yeah, it's useful to ask Google what their API value is.
Well, as I read, Bionic Android's libc doesn't support WHR like at all. It's
Okay,
size
so
of S1, so it's not really supported.
So then
So it's like big drawback.
Yeah, they do. They don't do localization in.
They do it, but on Java level.
Right.
And
That's what I
they
meant.
don't
Yeah.
care about like libc.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one thing yeah. To them, libc is pretty much another assembly level layer anyway. They keep the libc stuff as small as possible. Okay. So I want to make sure we get through benchmarking, which we've kind of already talked about. Obviously, we're going to need to put benchmarks in when we need to ship results.
So are there benchmarks? Are there existing stuff that people usually use that are relevant, particularly to the Android environment? Things, what would you benchmark? What would make sense?
Well, I think there are benchmarks. I mean, the OX bench, of course, runs many benchmarks for the system-wide behavior. I think talking about toolchain, are there toolchain benchmarks that are industry standard that we would want to build and include in our distribution?
As a toolchain group, we are currently looking at what other benchmarks we should be focusing on our as goals for improvement, right?
There is in Google like toolchain trees, there is benchmark this suite.
Okay.
So it uses, I don't know for sure, it's probably this compilation time, right? I'm not sure for sure, but there are lot of test cases. So this WebKit, Skia, Python, MPEG-4. So
Okay.
there is all this suite.
Okay. Oh, that's good.
So I guess you guys can check that out. I mean, that can possibly be answer your question. Okay. Any other thing on benchmarks?
Just from IRC.
Oh. Thank you. Okay, here we go.
Right. So
Oh.
so Google guys prepare one benchmark
Okay.
test suite, but it's bucky, so you have to work around it.
So have you guys met the OX Lab guys?
Sorry?
These guys, have you guys met each other? Because you guys are doing a lot of the same work, so. I mean, maybe not the same work, but you're consuming a lot of the work that they'll be producing. So get to know each other really well. Go have a dinner or something. Cool. Okay, and then GDB on Android. I'm guessing, you know, it's just something we need. Obviously, is there any changes that we're going to make? Jim, you know, you brought up.
I mean, as I said, I got an email just a week ago. Someone who was complaining about differences between the Android GDB and the Linaro GDB. So, if I understand correctly, so you also debug remotely, so you're on a GDB server on the Android device, and then you run GDB on your
Yes.
on your host. And so he wanted, for whatever reason, he wanted to use the Linaro GDB server on the Android device, and that didn't work. And that's why I looked into the sources and found out that there's a couple of hacks without which certainly will not work. So the question is, what do we want to support? Do we say we provide a GDB for the host, which talks to the regular Android GDB server?
If you check IRC, okay, can you open the URL? I just want to indicate a fact that the built-in GDB service is very bucky. You can check the URL. So that can you open the URL?
Into my screen. Wow.
Before Android 2.3 Gingerbread, before Gingerbread, the GDB can only debug single thread applications.
Okay.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah, but you can see the commit log in Google's NDK3. Yeah. So Google guys fixed that after 2.3. Okay. So I think that the problem is we might need to help Google engineer to fix some ridiculous bug there.
So the thing I'm concerned about is that, at least from those hacks I saw,
Yeah.
that's not really appropriate stuff for GDB to be doing. In fact, they point to problems in the rest of the system that should rather be fixed there.
Yeah, because Google guys always use the older version packages. So they use older version GCC, older version Windows GT.
Yeah, but that has nothing to do with older versions. They were doing things like GDB server checks whether kernel feature is supported at runtime and then uses it or not, and they just commented that check out and say, well, for some reason the check doesn't work, but we know the feature is there, so we use it anyway. So that's, I mean,
Yeah, you can see the commit log.
So
You can see,
I think, you know, actually this is perfect, right? This is a perfect opportunity for Linaro to help Google do their job.
you can
Not do their job, but do, you know,
Which
guide them the right
section.
way.
The root cause, you can see the syntax. This is ridiculous to many developers who want to debug a multi-thread application.
I mean, for example, right, I mean, how do Google engineers work typically, right? First off, they work like 1 billion hours, and they're being whipped from behind. So they don't really care about a lot of things that they should care about. But one thing we can do is help them out by, you know, essentially making the right change and saying, you know, please use this. This is more appropriate for. And this would be a perfect change to point out, you know, to users, because it is making it is actually improving the platform. You know, taking a hack that somebody did to just get a product out and actually making it real. And that's kind of the general theme of the whole game anyway. Is, you know, basically, I mean, Android's been running, you know, Google's been running as fast as they can, and so it's all hacks the whole way down. And Linaro is, part of Linaro's job is to make that better. Or else it's all just gonna be ugly.
Sure.
We're gonna live with this stuff.
I'm just saying that the way, sort of, in order to get rid of the hacks, it's not something you can do just in the toolchain, but it's something you need to fix properly in the rest of the system so that the hack in the toolchain is needed anymore.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, in part of, you know, what the platform team is really here to do is to make it so that builds and facilitate these communications and track these things so that people can focus on making these changes and easily testing them and working with Google and tracking, you know, licensing and, you know, what builds these things are in and all these other things. That thing work at all. So. Okay. Good. Fun.
So I guess trying to work sort of towards the future, getting rid of the hacks by fixing them properly elsewhere is one thing. The other thing is, so they introduced those hacks to the toolchain so that they can work around what bugs that exist on existing platforms, which users are using. So if we put out a replacement toolchain with, say, a replacement GDB, should that likewise have the same hacks to work around those problems that are currently out there?
I think that depends. It's going to be a case-by-case basis.
Yes. So,
One thing, though, we do have is, I mean, Linaro is going to be kind of like, well, hopefully Linaro is going to be kind of like the official place. Not necessarily contain a lot of, you know, it's not going to contain a lot of the hacks that Google's put in, but it's going to be a little more, it's going to be more quality, I guess, is the thing. So, you know, in the end, maybe that is what actually means that Google does pick up Linaro's chain, because we've actually managed to support their existing clients with good changes. And if that means that certain clients we have to change because the hacks aren't in there, then that just becomes a communication issue to work with whoever it is and whatever platform is having that. That's something that the platform team and everyone can help lend a hand in to fix the underlying issues. So, just a big dependency matrix. Okay. All right. So let's see. I think.
Just from a meta point of view,
Yeah.
one of the things is that the toolchain working group and a lot of Linaro sort of works upstream first, contributes things upstream. What's the methodology for contributing these merged patches back to Android?
Oh, yeah. So back to Android, it goes to AOSP.
And AOSP includes the toolchain and everything.
Yep. Yep.
what's
Every-
the
AOSP is the Android open source project. It's Garrett. You push to Garrett, you sign up for an account, and you just go through the Garrett cycle.
So is AOSP totally controlled by Google?
Yep.
Is there another company that you do?
It's all Google, and the Google engineers are the people that will be reviewing your patches and maintaining them. And if you've never, they they'll either do, I don't know, Jim is probably in a better position to talk about upstreaming to Google.
It's very simple. Google style, open source.
Right. I mean, usually, if the patch is good, they'll take it. If not, they just don't, they just ignore it. That's how, it's not even an interaction, right? It's like, oh, thanks, bye. But the good thing is it's, nobody belabors over, well, I don't know, it's like, okay, that's a good patch, I like that.
Do they
Or,
insult
this is
you?
crap.
Do they insult you?
Do they what?
Insult you?
They don't seem to actually. Actually, I find the AOSP community to be much more, I guess, much more pragmatic and a little more professional than, from a professional software engineering perspective than some of the open source community can get. They don't really take things personally. They'll tell you your work is, they'll typically tell you your work is kind of not appropriate for their tree, but they'll usually leave it at that. But I mean, it's all motivation, right? What changes do they want? They want changes that make their life easier and that get them to their goal faster. And upstreaming is a means to an end, because if you upstream, then it's easier on the back end as you go to upgrade.
Yeah,
So-
when you upstream, then they essentially put into the main branches, right? But when Google releases the next version, they usually actually branch out from the main branch and come out with a release branch.
Yeah.
So by the time you put into the upstream, not necessarily actually it will show up in the next version of Android.
Yes, but that is in essence what the Linaro goal is all about, right?
But normally they take whatever you push to the master branch and try to merge that to their internal tree. You can see a lot of comments that they have reviewed your patch and they think it looks good, they have even tested it, it works, but we will not accept it because it doesn't merge well with our internal tree.
So, but it's not guaranteed that all the changes on the main tree will be show up in their
No, that's not
release
guaranteed.
branch.
It depends on the timing.
Yeah.
For example, I contribute some biological changes last September, and I check Honeycomb source code. I have a blah blah blah. So the reason, so I check Honeycomb source code. My change is including Honeycomb, but it's the next to release.
So N+1 version,
Yes.
very likely it will be the N+1 version. So we're talking about at least 3 months gap, sometimes 6 months gap.
Yeah, it might be hell
Yeah.
later.
Don't think, there are no guarantees with any of this. This is all like, honestly, it's like you build a relationship with, that's why it's so important, that's why I mentioned building a relationship with the toolchain engineers. 'Cause
But that's exactly the problem we're trying to solve on the Linaro Toolchain side with our releases. So when we work on a new feature, we push it upstream, and it will show up maybe in a year because GCC release cycles are so long. And so we take the same feature that we pushed upstream and put it into our Linaro GCC source code. So it comes out next month when we push the next Linaro GCC release.
Yeah, but then when the next version of Android comes out, your toolchain may not work with them.
Yes, so and I understand that's exactly what you want to do here. Just like we do Linaro GCC releases, you want to do Linaro Android Toolchain releases. So it's not immediately in the Google toolchain, but it's in the Linaro Android Toolchain that you release every month.
Right.
Right?
Including the utility like prelinker
Yep.
and the compilation fix.
Yeah, it's really a motive for, it's an engine of change. It's like, it's kind of short-circuiting things, but in a sense, if you qualify and the build comes out and everybody has a better cell phone experience or mobile platform experience, because let's not get it wrong. If it gets into Google, right, it's going to be huge, and it's going to help millions and millions of people that would not have gotten the benefit from that otherwise. Power management stuff, anything that.
Power management.
I don't know how you guys can work with. Can you make some power management improvement?
We should.
Actually, I saw some cool stuff about some people researching power management. Actually using power management as a metric for algorithms now in compilers. That you don't want to use certain operations because they're power hungry, and other slower operations may actually make it.
That's, I guess, more of a wish list item these days, but nobody's really sure how to do that.
Yeah, so what do you do to improve power optimization? Reduce the amount of accesses you make to memory, that will save power. That will also make things go faster. So make the compiler go faster, and probably make it go
But actually,
use less power.
maybe that's not true, right? Maybe maybe at a microarchitectural perspective that's true, but maybe if you make less accesses to power, then things are going to take longer and actually take longer to run, which it would impact your power numbers.
So if you are, so the thing that you tried, so the papers that I've read with respect to power optimizations in compilers,
Right.
all of them seem to have a 1:1 mapping with respect to performance optimizations. They say reduce the number of memory accesses, reduce the amount of spilling by your register applicator. Try and do some cache related optimizations. Try and restructure your lay your structures out in a form that is good for the data cache and
Yeah.
things like that. Now those are things that will help performance anyway because you are reducing the number of accesses into main memory and so on. So I have seen those kinds of optimizations.
Yeah.
The other kind of optimizations is to say, oh, let me get information about, I don't know. The other kinds of things have been some kinds of modeling with power profiles of some instructions, but I don't know how that works.
That's awesome. I mean, I've seen it. I've read a couple of studies, but it's good to see that there's some definite conclusions on the experimentation. Or starting to be
That's my
characterization
interpretation based on my reading. I'm no expert on this.
So one thing is a general ask from above, which is, like I said in the beginning of this session, if there are any changes that you are thinking about that would have broad impact, even not even broad impact, mid impact, something that if you think about it, even it has the appearance of a broad impact, those would be great changes to get in by August. Because the idea is that Linaro can then point to those changes as things that we've done that have helped and have had big impacts. So if there's anything you're thinking about doing and you're like, well, is this a priority? It seems like the priority from above so that they can show it off to the members who are paying us is, yes, we're having a big impact because we're making toolchain changes and we're getting them out next month, and that's a big thing. And that's helping everybody in the community. So that's just an ask, and I'm just passing it down. So, anyway, I've gone 3 minutes over. Thanks for hanging out.
One more question. It's
Yes.
a general question. So you guys have Linaro is doing both toolchain optimizations for the Ubuntu distributions and Android, right? So what's the roadmap to have a single toolchain for both of them? It's not in the cycles, right? Doesn't look like it's going to be.
I mean, it's a goal.
It is a goal.
Go for the cycle for the
To have a single toolchain? Yeah, I mean, that's the goal is unification across everything. Toolchains,
So what
kernels.
does single toolchain mean? Single what?
Single toolchain, because as a user, I install one toolchains to my user local. I can just use it to build both Android and Ubuntu or whatever distributions that you can support.
So are we talking about cross or native builds? No, because the Ubuntu toolchain that we're building is native ARM toolchain.
Okay, untargeted compilation.
So for cross compilation, I guess we want to do cross compiler as well.
There's another absolute cross.
So what we could do is sort of build a single cross toolchain that targets either Ubuntu or Android, which I guess is possible, but you need two sysroots anyway, so.
You need a switch or something, right?
You need a switch which one to target in different sysroots.
And that, actually, I remember that there was a thread on this, right? About how this, or was that on hardware packs? Hardware pack-like things. Like, did it matter because, just for distributing, since you have to have two sysroots anyway? I guess what would you do? You just pass the flag that would say Android.
But anyway, I mean, for Ubuntu, usually people build native. You have an Ubuntu ARM built on your system.
Yeah.
That's a cross-compilation is possible, but it's not sort of common. Whereas with Android, I understand you always cross-compile. So that's, I mean, that's
I
different.
also heard about something about the building like a VPN for other distributions.
No. What we are doing is we want to provide a cross-toolchain that can be installed as a host on Fedora and on Windows. But we will always target only Ubuntu ARM, nothing else. But that is Linaro.
Linaro evaluation.
Yes.
Evaluation tools.
Okay, but your evaluation build would be based on the Ubuntu and,
Yes.
and Android.
No.
It will be the Linaro Ubuntu evaluation build that will run on an ARM Glue Linux system.
Yes.
Okay.
So I guess the requirement that I'm hearing is for those cross toolchains we're building, investigate whether we can do a dual target cross toolchain that can target either Ubuntu ARM or Android.
Yes.
That's possible. The question is,
For one, Ubuntu, real Linux, and Android have different build models. It makes little sense to try to use very same binary toolchain because make files are different, field configuration is different. So it's completely
Yeah, but you guys are trying to do a single kernels, right? When I build a kernel, I just want to use one toolchain without any changes, right?
No. We will use same source for
Same
the
source,
toolchain,
same
but
source.
different values.
yes, you will also use the same source for the toolchains, but it's two different builds. Right?
This is strange. Because I also like when I build a kernel, I just want to use a
So
toolchain.
what you're asking for
Yeah.
essentially is a toolchain that can build something for BSD and Linux into a single binary. And I'm not sure if that's possible.
It's actually okay to have
Because
have
these are two
multiple-
different APIs.
multiple tool chains, because as Paul points out there, when you build a kernel or anything in the Android toolchain, Android has everything with it. So
Yeah,
the cross tools are actually part of the distribution that
Yeah.
you put out.
But in the Android case, you build a kernel and the Android source, user space source, using the exactly same toolchain. You're not actually changing them.
No, that's fine.
Right.
Yeah, but I was also thinking about you have a kernel for the Ubuntu. You pretty much in the end you want to have one single kernel, right?
I don't think you can ever have a single kernel that runs both on Android and on Ubuntu. That's
No, I think you can. It's definitely possible to do, and it is definitely a goal.
I think a single binary, the same binary.
Same binary.
Same binary.
Same binary. That's the goal, ultimate goal.
Long-term goal.
So we will take 5 years.
I mean, at least I would have expected you want different configure options for, but okay, well, if it's possible.
Right, I mean, the idea is that it's, I mean, the way to get there, right, is, you unify the tool chain,
But
you unify the kernel.
you just said Android is using a different API, a different core API than Ubuntu.
Yeah, Ubuntu is using ARM Linux GNU API, which is AAPCS Linux, while I think Android is using AAPCS.
Look,
I'm not sure.
it can all, look, if look, so here's the steps, right? You get Google to pick up the Linaro toolchain. We switch the API to a native API. We take the kernels, we modularize and limit the number of Android differences. And then when the kernel comes up, you're either putting an Android distribution or an Ubuntu distribution. Simple. 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
Because I convinced Google to change the API, I thought there was some third-party applications you could download to Android. They all stopped working when you changed the API.
Yeah. Hey, I'm not saying any of this is easy or doable or impossible, but you gotta have a plan. Think big thoughts. All right. Thank you, everyone.